So it is my pleasure. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Julia Vitarello is the founder and CEO of Mila's Miracle Foundation. I am pleased to say she has some educational roots in Massachusetts, having studied at Amherst. She enviably spent many years in Italy and then settled in Boulder, Colorado, where she started a family. I've had the pleasure of speaking with her before this meeting, and now without any further ado, I would like to introduce Julia Vitarello. Thank you, Julia, for joining us.
My name is Julia Vitarello, as Zach mentioned. I'm the mother of Mila and the founder and the CEO of Mila's Miracle Foundation. A little bit about my daughter's story, but before I do that, I would like you to get to know her a little bit, and I'm going to show you a very short video of Mila's life before she was diagnosed with a rare disease.
My only sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray.
So our daughter's name is Mila Virginia Makovec. She was born on November 5th, 2010. When I think about Mila as an infant, I think about smiles and laughter and health. And
half an hour after she was born, she was strong enough to hold on to my finger, and I could almost pick her up off the bed.
When Mila was a toddler, she was a climber, she was a hiker, she was a runner.
How old are you, Mila? Here's our sugar high daughter.
Slide, slide, slide.
Very physical, always loved to ride a strider.
Nice, bug.
Play in the snow, go sledding.
Coming!
We noticed that Mila was getting stuck on her words. She would say, "Mommy, Mommy, I have to, Mommy, I have to," and not be able to continue. And then suddenly, around 3 years old, we started noticing that her feet were slightly unturned and she was walking strangely. And then at 4 years old, we noticed that she pulled books in close. And then around 5 years old, Mila's feet started moving really quickly in this strange pit-pattering way, and then she would fall back on her butt. And every time she stood up, she would fall back and stand up and fall back. You know, we took her around to different doctors who never could really kind of figure out what was going on with her. And then time passes, and then in just 1 month, everything can change. She could no longer see anything. What's brought her so much happiness is playing with her toys and or looking at her books and watching TV and playing with her brother, and suddenly it looked like she could no longer play with anything. It's so hard to see such an outgoing little girl not be able to play with other kids and not be able to play with toys and not be able to watch Elmo anymore.
Was incredibly outgoing. She was always the center of attention. She was a very typical Colorado child. She was hiking and skiing and rock climbing by the time she was 2 years old. For that, when she was about 2 and she was in preschool, her teachers pulled me over right after Thanksgiving and said, "You know, we went around the room and we asked all the kids what they did for Thanksgiving." And, you know, at 2 years old, the kids made little noises and said turkey. And Mila jumped up in the middle of the room and said, "I went hiking in Moab and ate baba ganoush." And, you know, that's who Mila was. She was incredibly outgoing. So as you can imagine, when she was about 3 and she started walking in a really strange way, I was concerned. But the doctors reassured me that she was going to grow out of that. and then it was normal. And then she started tripping over things and falling and walking across all of her toys. And I remember noticing that her books and toys were all broken. And then she started pulling objects in so close to her face part of the time, and part of the time she would be fine. To about 100 doctor and therapist appointments around the country between around 4 and 6 years old. And no one had any idea what was going on. Most of them thought she would grow out of these symptoms and that she was just really a normal kid with a few delays. And they kept using the word delays, but Mila was never delayed. She was always very advanced. And so I started carrying around a little piece of paper with me. It was a little scrap piece of paper that said neurological symptoms on the top. And I didn't really even know what that meant, but I started with walking, and then I had another column for vision. And then I added a column for stuttering, where she would get stuck on her words. And that list got longer and longer. And I would bring it around to the doctors, and they would all, tell me, I don't know what to tell you. And many of them did mention a line which now sticks in my head, which was, there is a very rare chance that this is something genetic, but it's so rare that I'm not going to even tell you about it. And at some point when Mila was 6 years old, I gave up. And she had so many problems at that point. She was falling every time she stood up. She could not get through the first 3 words of her sentence, and her behavior was changing. She was no longer an outgoing kid. She was reserved, and was the kid that was in the corner of the room, quiet, with a book pulled up very close to her face. I drove her to the emergency room at Children's Hospital Colorado, and I just hoped that there was no way they were going to release her until they figured out what was wrong. And I was right. And we were there for 1 week. And by the end of that week, they had run a genetic panel and done many different tests. And they told us that Mila had Batten disease, which is a very rare neurodegenerative genetic condition. To be honest, was relief after 3 years of running around and feeling like I was maybe crazy and making this up. I was being told that there was, in fact, actually an answer, and there was a genetic answer to why I was seeing the symptoms in Mila. However, just a few minutes Googling Batten disease to realize it was probably one of the most horrible genetic conditions you could ever be told. It was of dementia, Parkinson's, epilepsy, blindness, and I had had an incredibly normal, outgoing, active little child until a year or so before that. Was told that there was nothing I could do, that Mila had an ultra rare version of variant of an already rare disease. So I started reading. I read everything I could possibly read on Batten disease, on lysosomal storage conditions. I spoke with other parents of rare disease foundations, and that really changed things for me. They were fighters, and many of them, to be honest, had fought for their children, and it wasn't in time for them. But they gave me hope. They gave me the reason to start a foundation. So I started Mila's Miracle Foundation. I did not know what a 501c3 was at the time. I started raising money. I started speaking with scientists all over the world. And I was being told, we're probably about 10 years away from being able to crack Batten disease. It's incredibly complicated. And spend the time you have with your daughter, enjoy her. She's not going to live much longer. Disease parents really put a fire under me, and I decided to give it my very best shot. Mila, despite losing her vision and starting to say her very last words like mommy, I would spend the day trying to be present with her, and often spending a lot of the day crying in my closet. And then by night, when my kids were in bed, I would write blogs, I would talk to scientists, I would email, I would research, and I would tell Mila's story. I realized that was the only way I was ever going to raise the money that was needed. So I let everyone and anyone into my house, the news, reporters, and I just kept telling Mila's story to anyone. And eventually people started following her story. And I had about, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 people from 55 countries who supported Mila, who donated everything from $5 to thousands of dollars. And before I knew it, people, all over the world were following her story, and a lot of scientists were starting to pay attention as well. And I'd started originally a gene therapy because all we knew was what the gene was, and I didn't know anything else. So I started down that path. But as I started down that path, I realized that Mila had a half diagnosis. So she had only had one mutation found, and this was an autosomal recessive disease. So there needed to be a mutation from both mom and dad. Homework and realized that whole genome sequencing was going to be the only way to maybe give it a shot to find that other mutation. And so I did some reading and realized, that the labs kept coming back with one missing mutation, and I had to get to a lab that would do whole genome sequencing. I found a lab at Harvard, but the wait was 5 months, and there was no way I could wait 5 months. I needed to know that Mila, in fact, had CLN7, which was the variant of Batten disease that she was diagnosed with, to make sure I was going after the right gene in gene therapy. And I had a little son. My son was 2 years old at the time, had no symptoms, and I needed to know that he was going to be spared. And I was terrified every night for months. And so I reached out on Facebook one day, and I thought, I have no idea how I'm going to get into a faster track with this Harvard lab, but I just posted, can anyone help me speed this up? Does anyone know anyone at this Harvard lab? And no one did at first, but within 24 hours, I got a message back because my best friend from Amherst College, she was a doctor in Boston, had reposted my desperate plea to a closed Facebook group of physician mothers in Boston. And within 24 hours, that ended up on the desk of Dr. Timothy Yu, who is a neurologist and geneticist at Boston Children's Hospital and a professor at Harvard Medical School. And he called me the next morning and said, I don't know if I can help you, but I'm going to do my best and to find this missing mutation. But within just a few months, Dr. Yu called me back and said, we have had our entire team looking at Mila's genome, and we have finally figured out this missing mutation. It's something incredibly rare. And we have confirmed that, in fact, she does have Batten CLN7. And the great news is that I found out that my son was spared. He didn't carry either mutation, and he would never have Batten disease in his life. So after 5 months of crying every night that I put him to bed, I realized that motherhood was not going to be ripped from my arms for both my children. Discussion, and Dr. Yu then took it one step further. He was only there to help me find this mutation. And he said, I have an idea of a way I might be able to help your daughter. And he didn't want to get me too excited. This was just an idea. So I continued down the gene therapy path. But then within just a short period of time, his idea started to get some traction. A drug called Spinraza had just been approved by the FDA weeks after Mila was diagnosed, and it was for spinal muscular atrophy, another terrible, devastating genetic disease in children. And it had been a game changer. It was on everyone's mind. These children, were on respirators and little wheelchairs by 1.5, and they were not alive by 2. And suddenly, with Spinraza, many of them were living pretty normal lives and growing up and going to school. And Dr. Yu and his team, said, well, what if we made a Spinraza-like drug for Mila, but just for Mila, that was targeted to her mutation? And it was a crazy notion. And a lot of people said, how are you going to do that? And Dr. Yu said, but why not? Mila was declining rapidly. She was losing all of her abilities even after her diagnosis. She could no longer chew. She had to have a G tube put in. She started having uncontrollable seizures, 30 a day. And this drug looked like it might be promising. So over the next 7 or 8 months, Dr. Yu designed an ASO, or antisense oligonucleotide, like Spinraza, but targeted to Mila's mutation. He tested it in many labs, and he actually managed to collaborate with so many people in the industry. I mean, there must have been at least 100 people across different labs, different academic medical centers, companies, biotechs, who were all racing for Mila. And I think they were racing for Mila, and they knew that this was a real shot for her. And they also understood that this was a big deal for science as well, to be able to have a drug customized to one person. And within 1 year of meeting Dr. Yu in January 2017, by January 2018, we had moved to Boston. And the new drug, which was named Milasen after my daughter, had been given the green light by the FDA, who was incredibly collaborative and really understood the risk, benefit analysis for Mila. And after rigorous testing and animal studies, Mila was able to receive her first dose of Milasen in January of 2018. We moved from Colorado to Boston, and I remember the night before Mila received Milasen. This was an entirely new drug. It was the first time in the world where a drug had been customized to one person and had never been given to another human. And I said, what's the risk of treating Mila versus the risk of not treating her? And the risk of not treating her was incredibly obvious. She was going to lose every ability in front of my eyes, and she was going to die in the next few years. But this looked incredibly promising in the lab. It was, this drug was restoring health to my daughter's cells. And that didn't mean that it was going to be a magical cure for Mila, but it looked promising enough to really give it a shot. And I never thought twice, about whether or not this was worth it or not. This was an incredible opportunity for Mila that I never thought she would really have. So Mila is now 2.5 years into Milasen. She's 9 years old now. And in the first year after Milasen, we saw a pretty incredible stabilization of her disease. And we saw quite a lot of improvements. I mean, Mila had 30 seizures a day, like I mentioned, and she went to having basically none. If she did, she had a few that lasted a few seconds, and they just kind of were her body slightly moving instead of arms and legs thrashing and lasting 2 minutes at a time. Last year, it wasn't as promising. Her disease was continuing, but very slowly. And that's kind of what I've seen up until today. It's been a very difficult to understand that I've been together with Dr. Yu and his team for Mila. We all knew going into this that Mila was quite progressed when she started receiving Milasen. She was 7 years old, which in the world of bat and seal and 7 is quite progressed. She had lost a lot, but she was still very, very much herself. And that's why we really gave it the best shot we had. But I do realize that if Mila had been treated, or the future Milas were treated when they didn't have as many symptoms, who knows what future that could offer them. And Mila's story has been published by Dr. Yu and his team in the New England Journal of Medicine last October. We had press that covered us all over the world. And I had families. I've had an unbelievable number of families across many rare diseases reach out to me in desperation that they're trying their best to fight for their children. And what they're being given today is an empty toolbox, just like I was given. There is nothing being done for any of these 7,000 plus rare diseases. And a lot of time with Dr. Yu to think about, how can we turn all of the work and the passion and the tears and the incredible collaboration across all of science that was put into Milasen, how can we turn that into something that can really help many other children across many rare diseases? And it's been a few years where we've talked to many different people in this industry to decide what is the best way to do that. And I know one thing, which is that I cannot predict my daughter's future. I don't know what her future holds. I do know that I feel an incredible sense of obligation and responsibility to open up this treatment path for other families across every country with children who, many of which were normal and now are declining. They're losing abilities in front of them. They call me desperate and crying, and they want some hope. And right now, gene therapy is incredibly promising. but it is the only tool in the toolbox, and it requires a lot of time and a lot of money. And if you're lucky enough to have a child diagnosed in that's in a gene where there already is a gene therapy in the pipeline, that's incredibly exciting. But if not, there are all thousands of diseases, and having personalized, hyper personalized treatments as a field that could cut across many different rare diseases where there is no other hope and there is no other tool. This is an exciting opportunity that I think needs to be carefully and urgently explored. And so, Dr. You and I have spoken with everyone in this industry, from academic medical centers, worked very closely with the FDA, with the NIH, with scientists and doctors, with rare disease foundations. And we really started talking and collaborating with them. And we've decided that the best thing that we can do to open up this field is to start a foundation. So we actually have just launched a foundation. And the mission of that foundation is to make treatments like Mila's truly accessible across many different rare diseases. And that means collaborating, that means sharing data, and that means allowing for more Milas to receive treatments like Milacin. And we think that this could be something that could help a lot of children that have no other tool in the toolbox. So I'm hoping that together we can, everyone in this industry, to open up an entirely new field and a new treatment path of hyper-individualized or personal treatments. And I'm really excited to hear the panel discussions that follow, because they are very important questions that need to be addressed in order to help open up this field. So thank you very much for letting me tell my daughter's story. I'm here not to help my daughter. My daughter's been given an incredible chance, thanks to so many people probably in this audience. But I'm here to try to turn everything that's been done for Milacin into a way to really change this field in rare disease. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Every time I hear your story, but frankly, the story of all our keynote speakers, I cannot help but be awed by the energy and focus that families bring to their loved ones. I wish I could say that medicine can duplicate that, but I don't think there's any substitute for it. And I think that an effective precision medicine is always going to lean on families in the way it's happened in the case of Mila. So I made a boo-boo. I forgot to mention something. This is obviously a virtual conference, and it's really hard to have a conversation in a virtual conference. And so we're trying something which I hope you'll find not too gimmicky. We'll use Slido to invite questions from the audience for our speakers, as well as have some trivia questions for some competitive quizzes throughout the day. We'll be awarding cool, impressive, branded prizes to the top 3 participants who answer the most questions correctly today. But note, in order to actually receive a prize, you must enter your email address so we can contact you and then send you your prize. To participate, if you scroll down on this webpage, you'll see a frame just below the live stream where you can type your questions and also participate in the polls. Because I goofed and didn't say this earlier, let's give a few seconds to let you just try this poll. How many Americans have a rare disease? This is our trivia question. It's not yet one of our questions for credit for our prize, but this is a way of familiarizing you with that mechanism, with the Slido mechanism. Okay, right now we have 100,000 Americans are in the lead in terms of those having a rare disease. 10 million is now showing, well, the answer is, by the way, over 100,000 Americans. So thank you for exercising your Slido intelligence. And while you think of questions for Julia, let's actually start the official quiz. So Rachel Eastwood, who's one of the casts of a dozen behind the scenes helping us out, will run the first set of quizzes. So on your marks, get set. It's going to be fast. We don't want to spend a lot of time. Go. Good. All right. And empirically, the correct answer is from the largest studies available. All right, we have some astute observers here and listeners and scientists. So it is my pleasure to welcome questions from the audience. We have an overqualified filterer, queuer of the questions. Professor Arjun Manrai, that we often call Raj, is a professor at Boston Children's Hospital, trained in bioinformatics and in physics, and who has published very important studies about disparities in our populations, especially in African Americans, caused by misunderstanding of how genetic studies should be run. So as you enter your questions into the Slido box, Professor Manrai will be selecting them, highlighting them, and then reading them out loud. And I'll engage with Julia about them.
Sure. So, thank you, Julia. That was an absolutely fantastic talk, and thank you so much for sharing Mila's story. So we actually have the first question ready to go. It's highlighted and it's up on the screen right now. It's from an attendee at the conference who asks, "Thank you for sharing Mila's story. Were there any educational resources that were especially helpful when you were first navigating your daughter's disease?"
That's a great question, Julia. Where do parents go? I assume Google is the first, but Google is kind of a big bucket. What were the good resources, the best resources?
Good question. I have to be honest that it was not easy to find information. Google was the place that I first turned. And then from each article, to be honest, that I read, I found the names of scientists and physicians, and I found a way to get in touch with them, whether it was Googling them or reaching out to their institution and trying to track down their email or telephone number. A lot of bothering via email until people would respond to me. Once I would be able to get in touch with one expert in the field of Batten, I would ask them for advice on at least one other person that I could talk to. And that ended up being a chain of people until I kind of got to someone who could tell me something concrete that would help me better understand the disease. It required talking a lot of time a lot of flying to conferences, scientific conferences, and just noticing who there was possibly going to be able to help me with a better understanding of Batten disease and of translational options of what is a way that my daughter could possibly be treated. So I will tell you that it was not easy to find that information. The two organizations that I found in rare disease that were most helpful were NORD and National Organization of Rare Disorders, and Global Genes was also very helpful. Those both held conferences, and when I went to those conferences, I was able to meet other parents who led me to more information, and many scientists and physicians as well.
Thank you. The next question comes from Henry Way, and it's, thank you for your courage, resilience, and dedication to families everywhere. Have you heard of any innovation around payment for N-of-1 gene therapy, outcomes-based payment perhaps? So I imagine this is a much bigger question around payment and around how insurance interacts with this. But I think any insights you can lend us that way would be great.
Great question, and it's a very important one. I think, as I mentioned at the end of my talk, that accessibility is something that Dr. Yu and I are very interested in. It's why we started this foundation. We really want to make sure that treatments like Mila's are accessible across many different rare diseases. And what does accessibility mean? There's a lot of things that it means, but one of them is a model where there's a payer model where insurance is hopefully in the future going to help cover N-of-1 treatments. And it's something that I don't have an answer for right now, except for to say that it's absolutely on our radar, and we are very focused on trying to come up with a sustainable model in the future, and not just having to climb this mountain every time, because it's not doable. We can't climb the Milason mountain and start from scratch every single time, or else this path of hyper-individualized treatments will not open up. It will die. It's too much for parents. It's too much for PIs, for institutions. And so the way that I see this happening is that if everyone in this field, including payers, really see this as an incredible opportunity to greatly slow and eventually stop and help these, very terrible diseases like Batten disease, it will be a relief of a burden on the system, on top of for families, of course.
So this is our last question, comes from John Method. The hardest part of parents' rare diseases stories is to hear the length of the diagnostic journey before genetic counseling occurs. How can we shorten that part of the journey for future parents?
Definitely a very good question. It is the biggest complaint I get from other parents that reach out to me is that their children were misdiagnosed for years. And the amount of doctor's appointments where you're dragging around, in my case, a newborn son as well, to 100 different appointments was incredibly difficult. I think parents are often told in the early stages where symptoms are not very serious that they're a little bit crazy and that, their kid's going to be fine. That happened to me countless times. It's not a fun journey. I think that awareness is really important. And it's not just awareness within the scientific community, because the scientific community knows what genetic disease is. They're aware of this. The problem is all of those people out there, like myself, who had no idea that a typically developing child could lose abilities and die at a young age. I had never heard of that before. And so I think finding ways that are not threatening to allow physicians to, in the cases that I mentioned in my story, where doctors would say, well, there is a really rare chance that, it could be the reason that she's having vision problems, or her feet are interning, or she's getting stuck on words. It could be this very ultra rare genetic condition, but I won't tell you about it. So I think physicians need to find a way to talk about that without scaring parents, because it may not be that that's the case. But the way I see it is, if a child like Mila has more than one potential neurological symptom, it's probably worth looking into a little bit more seriously. When I would bring my little piece of paper around and I was at an ophthalmology appointment, I would have hoped that the ophthalmologist would have said, if it were just vision, maybe she needs glasses or there's something going on. But if she's also stumbling and falling and that's getting worse, and if she's also stuttering, and by the way, her stuttering wasn't normal stuttering, she was getting stuck on words and not be able to get past them. I would have hoped that the many doctors that I went to, that would have been a red flag, and that they would have at least started talking much earlier on about the possibility of a rare genetic disease, and found a way to not scare me, but educate me and go down that rabbit hole a little bit until I think we would have probably figured out that Mila had Batten disease earlier if one of those doctors had done that.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. Thank you, Professor Monroy. Julia, you did obviously a wonderful job, but you also did a wonderful job queuing up several of our next panels. For example, on the third panel, we have discussions about how do you educate physicians. On our second panel, we'll talk about some of the ethical issues.